It began on a quiet summer morning when Daniel Cole stepped out of his small wooden cabin, holding a warm cup of coffee in his hand, expecting the soft sound of birds, the gentle ripples of water, and the peaceful silence he always enjoyed at dawn. But the moment he reached the edge of his porch, he stopped breathing for a second. His dirt road, which usually stayed empty except for delivery trucks and his own pickup truck, was covered with a long line of fancy cars, shiny black sedans, expensive SUVs, bright convertibles, parked crookedly, blocking the whole path like a chaotic parade. Loud voices echoed through the trees, laughter bounced across the grass, music blasted from portable speakers, and strangers in swimsuits carried picnic baskets, umbrellas, coolers, and folding chairs toward the water, as if they had been invited to a beach party. And in the middle of all of it stood Karen Malley, the loudest, bossiest, and most dramatic woman in the entire Willow Creek HOA, waving her arms like a commander leading soldiers into battle. She shouted proudly, "Come on, everyone! The lake is open for all community guests today." Her voice rang across the water like a siren. Daniel's heart dropped, and a sharp pain shot through his chest. Not from fear, but from pure disbelief. This lake wasn't community property. It wasn't shared, it wasn't managed by the HOA, and it wasn't open for public events. It was his, entirely his. His grandfather had bought the whole lake and the surrounding land over 60 years ago, long before any HOA ever existed. The water, the dock, the fishing rights, the trees, the road, every single piece of it was private property. But now it looked like a festival, a beach party, a picnic ground, and a swimming resort all mixed together on land that only belonged to him. He walked down the path quickly, coffee sloshing inside the mug, his jaw tight, his heart beating faster with every step. As he moved closer, people rushed past him without even glancing in his direction. Children brushed against him with floaties wrapped around their arms. Teenagers dragged kayaks. A middle-aged man carrying a grill pushed past Daniel as if he were invisible. Daniel stared in shock at the giant red, "Private Property," no entry sign at the entrance. Dozens of people had walked past it like it wasn't even there. And on the dock, on his dock, dozens of Karen's guests were already sitting, chatting, unpacking, and dipping their feet in the water like it belonged to them. Daniel stepped forward and planted himself at the beginning of the dock, blocking anyone else from stepping onto it. But Karen spotted him immediately and marched over with fire in her eyes. Her lips pulled tight like she had been waiting for him to show up so she could start a fight. She stopped right in front of him, hands on her hips, and snapped, "Move!" Her tone wasn't a request, it was a command. Daniel kept his voice steady. "Karen, you can't do this. This lake is private. You can't bring guests here. Nobody can." Karen's face turned as red as a warning light. "This," she shouted, pointing dramatically to the water, "is community property, and you can't stop us." Her voice was loud enough that everyone nearby turned to watch. A few people even cheered for her, believing she was their hero, fighting for their right to use the lake. Daniel felt anger rising inside him, but he swallowed it, choosing calmness even though his hands trembled. "Karen," he said again, slower this time, "this is not community property. This—" Before he could finish, Karen snapped her fingers sharply, and a group of her guests stepped forward like she was some kind of queen giving orders. Daniel realized instantly this wasn't a random visit. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. Karen had planned this. She had organized a full event, invited dozens of people, told them they could use the lake, and now she wanted to turn this place into a public attraction. He watched as a woman set up a giant speaker on his dock. Another man hammered a tent stake into the ground near his shoreline, and children began jumping into the water, splashing loudly. His peaceful morning had turned into chaos in a matter of minutes. Karen leaned closer, her eyes filled with mock sympathy. "Daniel, sweetie," she said in a voice dripping with fake kindness, "the HOA voted last night to use this lake for community recreation. That means the lake is open now. You can't keep it all to yourself." Daniel blinked slowly. "Karen, the HOA can't vote on land they don't own." Karen waved her hand dismissively. "We can vote on anything we want. We're the HOA." Daniel stared at her, unable to believe the level of arrogance dripping from her words. She gestured again, and more guests streamed past him like a flood. One woman carrying a giant pink flamingo float bumped into him and didn't even say sorry. Daniel clenched his jaw. Karen, I'm asking you nicely. You can't bring people here. You know this isn't HOA property. Karen narrowed her eyes and crossed her arms. Watch me. Her voice cracked like a whip. She turned around and shouted at her guests. Don't listen to him. He doesn't get to make the rules here. The lake is ours now. Daniel felt something inside him break. Not anger, not fear, just a heavy sadness. This lake wasn't just water to him. It was his childhood memories. His father taught him to fish here. His mother used to sit on the dock and read books. His grandfather had built the old wooden boathouse by hand, plank by plank. Every quiet morning spent watching the sunrise over the water had healed a little part of him. This was his safe place, the only place in the world that kept him grounded. And now Karen was trying to rip it away in front of strangers who didn't even know its history. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything he could lose if he didn't act. He looked at the water, at the people invading his space, at the dock that once felt sacred and now felt violated. Karen looked at him like she had already won, like she had crushed whatever spirit he had left. She smirked and said loudly, "Go home, Daniel. Let the community enjoy the lake." Daniel lifted his chin. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the crowd. No, Karen stopped smiling. "Excuse me." Daniel took a step closer, standing firm. "I won't let you take what doesn't belong to you." Karen laughed, a loud, mocking sound that echoed across the water. "Oh, please," she said. "What are you going to do? Call the sheriff? Cry? Write a complaint?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he looked at her calmly, too calmly. Something in his eyes made her stop laughing. For the first time, uncertainty flickered on her face, because she finally realized something. Daniel wasn't scared. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't shaking anymore. He wasn't helpless. He was planning something. Something she hadn't expected. Something she couldn't control. And that scared her more than anything. It scared her enough that her voice cracked when she repeated, "Move now." But Daniel didn't move an inch. And that was the moment Karen realized her perfect little lake party was about to turn into a nightmare. His nightmare or hers. Only the next few minutes would tell. Karen stared at Daniel with growing irritation, her face twisting as if she couldn't stand the idea of someone resisting her for even a second. And before he could say another word, she stepped forward and waved a stack of random papers in his face, shouting, "Here! I have proof. I have emails. I have documents. I have permission." Even though the papers were nothing more than HOA newsletters mixed with printouts of rules she didn't even understand, but her loud voice made her guests cheer again as if she had just won a battle. Daniel looked at the papers with a tired sigh, not angry but deeply disappointed, because he knew she wasn't holding anything real, anything legal, anything that connected her to the lake, and yet she stood there acting like a queen defending her castle. Her guests pushed past him like he was invisible. One tall man dropped a heavy grill right in front of him on the dock, causing the old wood to shake. Another woman placed a cooler so close to Daniel's foot that it brushed his boot, as if they wanted to show they didn't care about his space, his rights, or even basic respect. Music got louder, children splashed water onto his legs, teenagers tossed a ball dangerously close to his face, and the quiet lake that once felt like home now felt like a crowded, noisy market. Karen folded her arms proudly and smirked at him, her eyes shining with victory, as if she believed she had already won the war. Daniel felt a slow burn rising in his chest. Not the kind of anger that made people scream, but the kind that made them quiet, still, and painfully calm. He lifted his eyes and met Karen's with a look she had never seen before. A look that made her step back half an inch, though she tried to hide it. "Karen," he said softly, "you know this is wrong." She flinched at the quiet tone more than she did when people yelled at her. "Wrong?" she shouted. "Wrong is you trying to control our community. Wrong is you thinking you own everything. Wrong is you blocking people's rights." She moved closer, jabbing her finger at him like he was a criminal. Her guests nodded and whispered among themselves, feeding her ego. But Daniel didn't move, didn't shout, didn't try to argue. He simply stared at the lake. His lake, now filled with strangers laughing loudly, trampling the grass, throwing trash on the ground, treating the place like a public park. A little girl accidentally kicked sand onto his jeans and apologized softly, but her mother grabbed her arm and pulled her away, whispering, "Don't talk to him, honey. He's trying to ruin the fun." That sentence hit Daniel harder than anything Karen had said. He wasn't trying to ruin fun. He wasn't trying to control anyone. He just wanted to protect what belonged to him and honor the memory of his grandfather who had spent most of his life caring for this lake. He remembered the stories his grandfather used to tell him, how the water healed people, how the trees carried secrets of the past, how they were the guardians of this land. And now, watching Karen's guests stomp over it all without a single bit of respect, he felt a deep sadness curl inside his chest. Karen, thinking he was about to give up, smirked wider and raised her hand dramatically. "Everyone," she shouted. "Daniel understands now. Let's continue our event." Cheers erupted, music got louder, and someone even lit a portable stove on the dock, filling the air with the smell of burning charcoal. Daniel looked at the smoke drifting across the lake and made a choice. Quiet, heavy, and final. Without saying a single word, he turned around. Karen burst into laughter, clapping her hands like she had won a trophy. "See?" she yelled to her guests. "He knows he can't stop us. This lake is ours now." But Daniel didn't turn back. He simply walked slowly toward his cabin, each step feeling heavier than the last. Not because he was defeated, but because he knew what he had to do next. Karen didn't know it yet, but she had just awakened the one part of him she should have never touched. The part of him that protected what he loved with quiet strength instead of loud anger. And as he reached the cabin door and placed his hand on the old wooden handle, a calm but powerful thought passed through his mind. Karen believed she had broken him, but she hadn't even seen the beginning of what he was capable of. Inside his small wooden cabin, Daniel walked straight to the back room without turning on any lights, moving like a man carrying a storm in his chest, every step slow and heavy. His face calm but his heart burning with a quiet pain that Karen could never understand. And when he reached the old metal safe sitting against the wall, the same safe his grandfather once used to store fishing knives and family letters, he took a deep breath and unlocked it. Inside lay a thick brown envelope that carried more power than Karen's entire HOA board combined. The original property deed, maps, water rights documents, handwritten notes from his grandfather, and legal papers older than most people in the neighborhood. He touched the envelope softly for a moment, feeling a wave of memory rush through him. His grandfather's voice teaching him how important it was to protect their land, how the lake wasn't just water but family history, how the old man had spent decades fighting developers and greedy neighbors to keep the lake safe. And now Daniel felt the weight of those years rest on his shoulders. He gently lifted the envelope and walked outside again, each step steady, each breath slow, as if he was walking into a silent battle that only he understood. When he reached the lake, the chaos was louder than before. Kids screaming, adults arguing over where to set their chairs, someone dragging a kayak loudly across the dock, a man playing loud music like it was a public festival, trash already scattered across the grass. Daniel's heart twisted painfully seeing empty cans floating near the shore, mud smeared across the dock his grandfather built by hand. Karen's guests were so deep in their fun that not one of them noticed Daniel returning until he stepped onto the dock with the envelope in his hand. Suddenly the laughter dropped, conversations slowed, and dozens of eyes turned toward him. Karen froze mid-sentence when she saw the envelope, and her confident smile began to fade just a little, though she tried to hold it together. Daniel didn't shout, didn't raise his hand, didn't threaten anyone. He simply opened the envelope slowly and pulled out the thick, official property deed with its old stamps, signatures, legal seals, dates, and handwritten annotations, shining clearly even from a distance. Karen walked toward him quickly, her shoes slamming against the wood, her eyebrow arched in false confidence. "What is that?" she demanded, though fear flickered in her eyes like a candle in wind. Daniel didn't answer her. Instead, he held the deed up for everyone to see. and a strange quiet spread across the lake, replacing the loud music and laughter. Karen snatched the document with shaky hands, her eyes scanning the bold letters that read, "Sole Private Ownership." The color drained from her face when she saw the date. Decades before the HOA existed, decades before the community was even built. She flipped the page desperately as if hoping to find a mistake, something she could twist or argue about. But each page only made it worse. Lake, dock, shore, land. It all belonged to Daniel. Completely, legally, permanently. A thick silence wrapped around her as her guests leaned closer, whispering in confusion. Is it real? He owns the whole lake? Why did Karen tell us it was community property? Karen's hands trembled, but she forced a fake smile and shouted, "This must be fake. This doesn't prove anything. Anyone can print papers." But her voice cracked, losing strength. Daniel took the deed back gently, and in a calm voice said, "Leave." Karen's guests exchanged uncomfortable looks, some already backing away, and a few parents hurriedly grabbed their children out of the water. Karen panicked, stepping between Daniel and the crowd, yelling, "No! Nobody leaves. This lake is still ours. He can't lock us out. Don't listen to him." But her words didn't carry the same fire anymore. Her voice sounded desperate, thin, hollow. Daniel stood tall, not angry but heartbreakingly calm, like a man who had tried everything else and finally chosen truth over noise. He looked at the lake, his memories being stepped on, and something inside him hardened. He wasn't going to let this continue. Not today. Not ever again. And as Karen's own guests slowly stepped backward, unsure of what they had walked into, Karen realized the truth. Her control, her confidence, and her power were slipping through her fingers like water she could never hold. And for the first time that day, she looked genuinely afraid of what was coming next. Karen's fake smile crumbled the moment she sensed her guests stepping away from the dock, her eyes darting from face to face as if begging someone, anyone, to back her up, and when nobody did, fear twisted into anger, the only weapon she knew how to use. She stomped toward Daniel, jabbing her finger into the air like she was stabbing the sky, shouting, "Fine. If you think this paper changes anything, then guess what? I'm calling a special HOA meeting right now. We will vote to designate this lake as community space." Her voice shook, not from confidence but from desperation, like a drowning person grabbing at anything to stay afloat. Daniel just stood there, holding the deed, watching her meltdown with a look so quiet and steady that it almost made Karen tremble. "Karen," he said softly, "you can't vote to take land that you don't own." She didn't listen. She never listened. She grabbed her phone and dialed number after number, pacing like a furious storm cloud. Within minutes, HOA board members began arriving in their neatly polished cars, stepping out with confused faces, adjusting their shirts, looking from Karen to Daniel like they had walked into a fight they weren't prepared for. Karen immediately rushed toward them, pointing dramatically at Daniel, yelling, "He blocked my guests. He threatened us. He's refusing to let the community use our lake." Her voice echoed across the water, but even the board members seemed surprised by how shaky she sounded. Daniel didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't even move. He just watched, his eyes cold but calm, as if he had accepted that Karen needed to scream before she collapsed under her own lies. The board gathered in a small group, listening to Karen's exaggerated story, her hands waving, her face red, her voice trembling with panic disguised as anger. She painted Daniel as a monster, a selfish neighbor, a man trying to steal community resources. But her words floated weakly in the air, losing strength with every breath. When she finally ran out of things to lie about, Daniel stepped forward, lifted the deed again, and handed it to the board without saying a single word. The treasurer, a quiet man with gray hair and tired eyes, took the papers and read them slowly, his fingers tracing the dates, the stamps, the legal codes. His face went pale. "Karen," he whispered, "this land, this lake, it predates the HOA by 40 years. Karen's lips parted, but no sound came out. The board members exchanged nervous looks, their confidence crumbling like sand. Daniel watched them, feeling both relief and sadness. A sadness from knowing that people he once respected had believed Karen without question. Karen grabbed the papers back and scanned them again with wild, desperate eyes, flipping through pages as if she could force the words to change. "No, no, no, this can't be right," she mumbled. "There must be something, somewhere, a rule, a loophole." But the more she searched, the more helpless she looked. Daniel could see her fear growing, like a crack spreading across glass. The board members stepped aside, whispering among themselves, clearly unhappy with how Karen had dragged them into something they didn't understand. She tried to gather her pride, lifting her chin and barking at them again. "Well, do something. Say something. You're the HOA board." But the board did nothing. They were frightened of the truth, frightened of the consequences, frightened of how badly Karen had led them. The lake fell silent except for the sound of soft waves brushing against the dock. Karen looked around, her eyes wide, her breath short, realizing that for the first time in her life, nobody was standing with her. She was alone, completely alone, and Daniel, standing tall and steady, holding the deed that proved everything she wanted to deny, watched her with a calmness that broke her more than any shouting ever could. It was the moment she realized her power was slipping away, and she had no idea how to stop it. The HOA board stood frozen for several long seconds, staring at the deed in the treasurer's trembling hands as if the papers were glowing with a truth too bright to ignore. And while the board members exchanged worried looks, Karen kept pacing like a trapped animal, her breath coming fast, her words tumbling out in panicked fragments that made no sense. But Daniel simply stood near the dock, his arms relaxed by his side, his expression painfully calm as he watched the people who once believed Karen begin to question everything she'd ever told them. The treasurer cleared his throat quietly and said, "We have no authority over this lake, none." His voice cracking as if the admission itself hurt him, and the secretary beside him shook her head slowly, whispering, "This land was never HOA property. It was never ours to touch." Karen spun toward them, her hair whipping across her face, her eyes wild, shouting, "No! Don't say that! Don't you dare say that! He's tricking you! He's tricking all of you!" But even as she yelled, her voice shook with fear, the kind of fear that comes when a person watches the world they created start collapsing in front of them. The board members stepped away from her, forming a small circle as they reviewed the deed again and again, each page making their faces grow paler. One of them sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead, and muttered, "Karen, you lied to us. You told us this lake was unclaimed land. You told us it was community-owned." Karen's mouth opened and closed like she wanted to explain but couldn't find words big enough to hide her lies. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. Karen turned to the crowd desperately and yelled, "Everyone, stay where you are. Don't listen to them. Don't go anywhere. This lake is ours. This lake belongs to the HOA." But her guests were already backing away, their excitement turning into embarrassment as they whispered things like, "Did she really lie?" And, "She dragged us here for nothing? And we could get in trouble for this?" A mother grabbed her son's hand and hurried toward her car, avoiding Karen's furious glare. A man with a cooler muttered, "I'm not getting fined because she made stuff up," before rushing off as well. Karen's face twisted with panic as she realized her grip on the crowd was slipping like water in her hands. The board members approached her hesitantly, as if they were afraid she might explode, and the treasurer held out the deed again, saying softly, "Karen, we can't support you in this. This is private land. Daniel has full rights." She knocked the papers out of his hands, sending the pages flying across the dock. Gasps echoed through the crowd, the board members stepping back in shock. But Daniel walked forward slowly and picked up each page with a steady hand, treating the documents like something sacred. When he stood up again, he looked directly at the board and asked in a quiet voice, "Are we done?" The board members nodded silently, their eyes lowered in shame. Karen, however, wasn't done. She wasn't ready to lose. She grabbed her phone again and threatened, "If you don't defend me right now, I'll have the entire community vote all of you out. I'll take your positions. I'll run the HOA myself. I'll make sure you regret ever siding with him." But her threats only made the board step away further, their faces tight with anger. One board member, a woman who had always feared Karen, finally found her courage and said, "You dragged us here under false information. You embarrassed this entire neighborhood, and you disrespected private property. This isn't leadership, Karen. This is chaos." Karen froze, her mouth falling open as if someone had struck her. She looked at Daniel, at the board, at the guests fleeing the scene, and for the first time in years, she wasn't the loudest person in the room. She wasn't the one in control. And Daniel, standing tall at the edge of his dock, watching the truth crush her lies piece by piece, felt something shift inside him. Not pride, not victory, but a deep, heavy sadness for a woman who could have simply apologized, but chose destruction instead. Karen stood on the dock shaking, her breath short and sharp like she was choking on her own anger, and when she realized the board wouldn't fight for her, wouldn't rescue her, wouldn't stand between her and the truth staring her in the face, something dark and reckless snapped inside her. Something so wild and desperate that even her closest friends stepped back from her as she screamed, "Nobody leaves! Everyone stay in the lake. Stay on the dock. Do not move." Her voice cracked like broken glass, echoing across the water in a way that made even the birds go silent. Her guests stared at her in confusion, some still waist deep in the water, some holding towels, unsure whether to listen or run, and Karen pointed at Daniel like she was accusing him of a crime, shouting, "If we stay long enough, he'll have to negotiate. He will have to. He cannot force out a whole community event." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, his face empty of anger, empty of fear, holding only a deep exhaustion, the kind that comes when someone reaches the limit of their patience. He didn't shout, didn't argue. He simply turned around and walked toward his cabin with slow, steady steps that sent a cold chill through Karen's spine, because she knew this wasn't the walk of a defeated man. It was the walk of someone who was done talking. Inside his cabin, Daniel walked directly to a small electrical box near the back window, opened it, and flipped a heavy switch down with a firm click. Outside, a low rumble rolled through the ground like thunder waking from sleep. Karen's eyes widened, her stomach dropping as she watched a thick steel gate rise from the hidden posts buried beneath the dirt road. An automatic private road gate that Daniel rarely used, one he only activated during hunting season or when he needed the property fully secured. Now the gate rose higher, clicking into place with a loud metallic slam that echoed across the lake like a judge's gavel. The crowd gasped, Karen's face drained of color. The gate locked with a hard mechanical clank that sent a wave of panic through every guest still on the property. One man tried to run toward the exit, but the gate was already sealed shut, towering in front of him. A woman yelled, "Are we trapped?" And children began crying as their parents hurriedly pulled them from the water. Karen spun around in disbelief, shouting, "You can't do that. You can't trap people. You can't just close the road." But Daniel walked slowly back to the lake, his expression calm, almost heartbreakingly calm, and said, "It's private land. I can close MY Road whenever I want." His voice was soft, but every word hit Karen like a hammer. She felt the ground slide out from under her. Her guests rushed around in panic, gathering bags and shouting at each other, "Get the kids! Pack everything! We need to leave!" While others muttered angrily, "This is insane. Why did we listen to her? We could get arrested." Karen grabbed her hair with both hands, pacing back and forth, shaking with frustration and fear. She shouted at Daniel, "You can't just lock us in. That's illegal." Daniel stared at her with the calmness of a man who had been pushed too long. "Illegal," he said quietly, "is trespassing on someone's property after they told you to leave." Karen opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked around, realizing the truth. She had no control, no power, no rescue plan. Her own guests looked at her with anger and betrayal. A few pointed at her accusingly, shouting that she had lied, that she had dragged them into trouble, that she had made them believe the lake was theirs. Someone yelled, "If the sheriff gets involved, this will go on our records." Panic spread like fire. Karen tried to yell over the noise, tried to gather control again, but her voice cracked under the pressure, sounding weak and hopeless. She watched as Daniel took out his phone, not rushing, not shouting, and she knew exactly who he was calling. And at that moment, for the first time that day, Karen understood something she had refused to see. Daniel wasn't scared of her, her board, her rules, or her threats. He was done being quiet. He was done being pushed. And now he was taking everything back. The moment Daniel lifted his phone to his ear, Karen's world began to collapse around her like a breaking dam, because she knew exactly who he was calling, and the fear in her eyes grew deeper with every passing second, her breath becoming shaky, her hands trembling as she watched him calmly report the situation to the sheriff. His voice steady, emotionless, almost too quiet for someone whose entire morning had been destroyed. When he ended the call, the panic among the guests erupted again, people dragging their bags, shouting at their kids, demanding answers from Karen, accusing her of lying to them, tricking them, using them for her own ego, and Karen tried to defend herself, but her voice drowned under the noise, every word sounding weaker than the last. Minutes later, the distant sound of sirens echoed through the trees, growing louder and louder until two sheriff vehicles pulled up to the closed gate, their lights flashing across the lake like cold blue lightning. The gate clicked open from Daniel's remote, and the officers stepped inside with serious faces, instantly sensing the chaos and tension in the air. The sheriff, a tall man with a calm but firm presence, walked directly to Daniel and said, "You the property owner?" Daniel handed him the deed without hesitation, and the sheriff read through it quickly, nodding with each page, his expression becoming clearer and clearer. Daniel was right, completely right. When the sheriff turned toward Karen, her whole body stiffened, her eyes darting around as if searching for a hole to crawl into, and the sheriff asked sharply, "Ma'am, why are you and your guests on private property after the owner told you to leave?" Karen burst into frantic excuses, her words tumbling out in a mess. "We thought it was community. The HOA said, we voted." He didn't explain. "This is unfair. He trapped us. He tricked us. He's lying. This lake should be for everyone." But every sentence sounded more childish than the last, every explanation falling apart before it even finished. The sheriff held up a hand, shutting her down immediately. "Enough," he said, his tone cold. "You organized an illegal event on land that does not belong to the HOA. You trespassed, you ignored signs, you ignored warnings, and you encouraged dozens of people to break the law." Karen's mouth hung open as if she had forgotten how to breathe. Behind her, her guests stood silently, their heads bowed, each one waiting for the sheriff's judgment like students waiting for punishment. And then the sheriff pulled out a small stack of citations, thick, official, unavoidable, and began handing them out. Trespassing, property damage, noise violation, illegal gathering without permit, endangering minors. Each paper hit Karen's shaking hands like a weight added to her downfall. Her guests received tickets too, their faces turning bright red, some nearly crying, others glaring at her with pure hatred. One woman snapped, "We trusted you. You said this was allowed." Another man added, "You're paying my fine, Karen. You dragged us into this." Karen backed away, shaking her head violently, whispering, "No, no, no. This isn't happening. This isn't real." But reality stood right in front of her wearing a badge. Meanwhile, the sheriff turned back to Daniel, his voice softening. "If she ever sets foot on this property again, or tries to bring people here, call me directly. She'll be arrested next time." Daniel nodded, feeling a slow wave of relief wash through him, the kind that comes after holding your breath for too long. As people hurried to leave, rushing toward their cars, avoiding Karen like she carried a storm on her shoulders, Daniel walked onto his dock and looked out over the water, his chest rising with deep emotional tiredness. The lake was quiet again, the waves gentle, the air calm, and for the first time all day, he felt like his grandfather's land was finally safe again. Karen stood alone near the road, her hair messy, her clothes wet, her face streaked with tears she tried to hide, watching everything fall apart around her. The people who once followed her now avoiding her like she was invisible. She whispered one last broken sentence. This wasn't supposed to happen. But Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was her punishment. The silence was her lesson. And as he stood on the dock, listening to the soft water brushing against the wood, he knew one thing clearly. After today, nobody, not the HOA, not Karen, not anyone, would ever dare step onto his land without permission again. The lake was finally his again. Peace had finally returned. And Karen would never forget this day for as long as she lived.